Today is the second Sunday of Easter. Now, in our 5th week of official quarantine, we too are finding ourselves hidden behind closed doors. As the disciples were in fear of their lives, confused about the events of only a week ago that led to their leader Jesus' death, not knowing what to do next, we too are finding ourselves living in fear, confusion of conflicting facts, not sure when it will be safe for us to emerge from the safety of our locked doors. With the nation's death toll reaching higher each day, and with the rising number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 here in our own city, we too are living in fear and in the darkest hours that many of us are acquainted with. In this second Sunday of Easter, we find a continuation of the resurrection story. It is now evening. The disciples, not believing Mary Magdalene's story of talking with Jesus, are holding themselves behind locked doors. Suddenly, Jesus mysteriously appears. Finally, all of the disciples experience a risen Savior, all except Thomas, who was not present. Coming in late, the disciples tell Thomas that Jesus had been visiting with them. And Thomas, not believing their story, says that before he will believe this outlandish tale, he would have to personally touch the wounds that Jesus received from his crucifixion. A week passes by. Thomas is now with the rest of the disciples, still hiding behind locked doors, when Jesus appears again. Jesus specifically singles out Thomas and invites him to prove to himself that he is indeed standing in front of him. And immediately Thomas exclaims, "My Lord and my God." Now, all of the disciples have had the opportunity to see Jesus post-resurrection. The resurrection stories about Jesus, they are very confusing to our modern society. These stories, if taken at fact value, demand that we ignore hard science for supernatural events. And much of today's generation says to the church, "Oh, come on, guys. You don't really think we are so naive as to believe that you are telling us about an empty tomb, that somebody has magically raised from the dead? Nobody comes back from being dead." Or do they? In Mel Brooks's movie, Young Frankenstein, the grandson of Baron von Frankenstein, the young Frederick Frankenstein, the young man had distanced himself from his assumingly crazy grandfather, takes up the family business of trying to create life from dead tissue. With the help of his assistant Igor, they find a freshly executed criminal and prepare the body for the transplant of a brain of the deceased Hans Delbruck, a brilliant scientist. So as Igor attempts to steal the brain for his employer, he drops the jar that contains the brain. Igor quickly grabs the closest jar, which contains another brain, and takes it to the young Frederick, at which time the doctor transplants the brain into this body of the 7-foot corpse. After the doctor completes his examination and brings the body back to life, the doctor realizes the newly created creature has a flawed brain. At which point, Igor has to admit of not bringing Professor Hans Delbruck's brain, but rather the brain of somebody by the name of Abby Normal. Okay, so let me switch gears here and state that these stories about Jesus' life were written for those who already believe of Jesus as the Christ. The Gospels were not written as evangelical tools to sway non-followers toward Christ. These stories were written so that those who believe in Jesus might learn more about him, and were designed to strengthen and encourage those first century followers of Christ. So, what then is the meaning behind the story of Jesus' empty tomb, of coming through locked doors, of staying around to be with his disciples instead of going directly on to God, his Father? How are we who call ourselves believers and followers of Jesus to understand this part of the resurrection story? I think one of the main takeaways of this story is to assure us that we cannot hide from God. That even when we are hiding behind locked doors, God is still able to enter into our lives. I think this story is an assurance that even in our darkest hours, hiding in our deepest fears, living life where nobody can enter when we lock them out, God is still able to come to us and to engage us with a resurrection from what we are hiding from. With Thomas, I'm not so sure that doubt is so much what is being stated by him as much as it is the desire to have had that same experience that the other disciples have just had with Jesus. After all, Thomas has been following Jesus a very long time, and he has seen many miracles that Jesus had performed. He understands that Jesus was something special. I think he was wanting to have that same experience that his fellow disciples had had. Second takeaway is found in Jesus granting Thomas his own request. We too can count on God meeting our deepest needs for assurance of not being left behind. This story speaks directly to families who are now experiencing the agony of dropping off their loved one that is infected with the virus at the entrance of an emergency room, and not knowing if that is going to be the last time that they will see that person alive. The anguish that must be present in this act cannot be anything less than what those who saw Jesus killed must have experienced. There are families who, like the disciples, are riddled with guilt and fear and doubt as they leave their loved ones behind and as they themselves go into lockdown. Guilt about deserting their loved one or feeling that maybe they didn't do enough. Fear that they too might be infected, and the uncertainty of, will I survive? Then there is the doubt about whether there is even a God. with that question, where is God in the midst of all of this? There is uncertainty of what will the future be like. How do we move forward after all of this is over? Then Jesus shows up, somehow gaining passage through our locked doors of our heart, mind, and our soul. So I want to refer back again to this movie, Young Frankenstein. There is a scene in which the young doctor finally accepts his birthright and identity and identifies himself no longer as a Frankenstein, but as a Frankenstein. With this claim to his birthline, he then goes to the creature that he has created, a creature that has become known to the public as a monster, and proclaims to this creature that he is not unloved, unwanted, or evil, as the world has labeled him, but rather is worthy of love, of the Creator's love, and is accepted and loved by that one who has created him. And yet, this wasn't enough. So in this final act of love, the doctor hooks himself and the monster to a machine that performs a transference of some sort that is giving part of the creator, the doctor, going into the creature, and vice versa, thereby stabilizing the creature into a whole human being. This is the Easter story. This is what it is saying to us with Jesus going into his disciples behind the closed doors. It is a story of Jesus once again seeking out his flock, those who are filled with guilt or fear, with doubt, yearning to see him. In that encounter, Jesus gives strength, direction, and the ability to move beyond the perils of daily living. It is Jesus who refuses to let hearts hide in anguish behind the deadbolts of guilt or fear or doubt. These feelings that can block a relationship with God. It is a story about Jesus coming again and again to those of us who are scared and confused in a world which is filled with so much uncertainty, pain, and even death. It is a story of a Jesus who offers himself to those who long to see him. It is our story of faith, of the one who comes through locked doors, touching anyone who is yearning for the peace that comes through the pure love of God. It is our story of Jesus coming to touch us, allowing us to check the wounds, to verify the story that God still comes, even when we have our doubts. May God bless us throughout this week. Amen.